Albert Lee Seed is proud to support the Back to the Roots podcast. Like you, they value the one-on-one conversations with farmers and other agricultural professionals that you hear on this show. Albert Lee Seed helps organic and transitional farms with a full line of organic and non-GMO farm seed for corn, soybeans, forage and pasture, cover crops, and cereal grains. Check them out at alseed.com. That's alseed.com.
You're listening to Back to the Roots podcast. I'm Mike Klein, and along with Brian Wood today, we are sitting down with Glen Borgerding. He owns Ag Resource Consulting Incorporated in Albany, Minnesota. Glen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, glad to be here.
So can you kind of fill us in about what you do?
Ag Resource Consulting, we're located in Albany, Minnesota. Been in business for 36 years. We are an independent crop consulting company and a soil testing laboratory. We test soil, we test manure, an MDA certified, Minnesota certified laboratory, which you need to be if you're going to be doing nutrient management work. You need to work with a certified lab. So, we started probably back in 1983. 84 would have been my first season. And I started out with a Lamont soil testing kit and was real passionate about learning about soils and testing soils. And it was a great learning tool. It was just the best thing you can do. Like I always say, if you want to learn about soil, spend half your time in the field digging around and half your time in the lab, running analysis. And it also helps us understand how soil tests work, the chemistries behind the extract solutions, and how useful, well, they're useful, but where the strong points and where the weak points are. Because I think the average person that's interpreting soil analysis is just looking at numbers at the page. And what this has allowed us to do is really understand the chemistry that's behind it. And so we get a much broader perspective of what's going on behind the scenes. And we experimented with a lot of soil testing methods, different extract solutions, in comparing one versus the other, the differences. And it's a very regional thing. In some parts of the country, they'll use certain soil extracts. In other parts of the country, they come up with their own or different variations. And the important thing to realize is when it comes to soil testing that the fertilizer recommendations are actually calibrated through a lot of field research, and they're calibrated on specific soil tests. And so it doesn't work to interchange them very well. It's like if you're using a Malic 3 extract and you're making recommendations that were calibrated using, let's say, a Bray extract or ammonium acetate. It's kind of like using a Ford owner's manual on a Chevy vehicle. It's not quite exactly the same. Or you're navigating through Minnesota with a Wisconsin road map. So that's really important to keep in mind. But enough of the soil testing. I think we started with that Lamont soil testing kit, and then through the 80s, by the late 80s, there was legislature passed that if you're going to be a soil testing laboratory and you're going to be making nutrient management recommendations, you needed to use the adopted soil test extracts, for these reasons. And so then we switched to different methods, different extracts, different instruments. And in the early 90s, then we got the lab certified. And that opened a lot of inroads up to us, because once we had gotten there, that was the time that a lot of the agency programs like NRCS, they had that back then it was WQIP, which is a Water Incentive Quality Program, and they changed the name of that to EQIP, which is Environmental Quality Incentive Program. And so we started writing plans for farmers that met new NRCS requirements. And eventually we became technical service providers for NRCS. So we write nutrient management plans. We do CAP 138 organic conversion plans we write for farmers. So we got into that whole thing too. So nutrient management planning became more of a staple of what we did. And we eventually changed our fertilizer recommendation, manure application recommendation systems to incorporated all that in. So if you're in like a feedlot inspection, that at least most of the pieces were in place and they could see that you were doing a good job. And of course, what's really important with this is, I might be getting ahead of myself. Let's just kind of go back a little bit and basically the philosophy of what we do and why we do it. So when we got into getting into the late 80s, things were changing pretty rapidly. But we were always really interested in nutrient cycling, rotations, sustainable ag practices. In the 80s, I got involved with the Sustainable Farming Association, Minnesota. So I spent a lot of time helping develop that. I was on the board of directors for that for a pretty good handful of years. And so that the focus was always on sustainable ag. And then in the late 90s, the late 80s, and I started working with farmers that were organic. And then I think in 1990, I was elected to the board of the Organic Growers and Buyers Association out of New Brighton, Minnesota. And I was on their certification committee and was the chair of that certification committee from 1990 to July of 1994. And then I was picked up by the OCIA Minnesota chapter. And so I spent at least 10 years on certification committees. And developing standards, developing all the pieces, and then of course the NLP, when that kicked in the early 2000s, 2001 or 2, whenever that was, and then I pretty much stayed out of that because my own business was growing, getting more clients, and I didn't have time. But just implementing those principles and those methods in working with farmers. So then the 90s rolled in, and then Japan got in the soybean market, and then that's when all the CRP acres were coming out, and most of those CRPs could roll right into organic, and so I was contacted by farmers, by brokers, connecting us with farmers to help them go through the process of becoming certified organic.
What percentage of the farmers that you work with now are organic?
Right now, about 75%.
Okay.
The farmers we work with are organic.
You were working with, you said sustainable and organic was kind of your focus almost right out the gate, and before there were ever any actual regulations, USDA regulations on it.
Yeah, that's correct.
Was that something, were you interested in that because of something you were seeing in your soil testing, just that these were better practices, or was there something else that was, did you just have a natural tendency to want to
It was probably more of a natural tendency because I grew up on a dairy farm. It was 173 acres. My dad milked 53 cows. And I was really on track to be doing that, but I met some key people, and they really turned on my interest in soil and soil biology. I mean, it's, for those of us that are really into soil, it's something that really pulls you in. And then there was a relationship about soil and, how you treat it. It comes down to the crop rotations that you're putting on and understanding the nutrient cycling. Like you have a good crop rotation, you got alfalfa and you get a lot of nitrogen from alfalfa, going into the next crop, let's say corn. And then you've got your manure applications that you're putting on, and just kind of orchestrating all that. So you're really fine tuning it. And I really had a passion and a zeal for that. The ironic thing is that when I got out of high school, the only thing I knew for sure is I didn't want to go back to any more school. And so everything that I learned was really self-taught. I mean, there were a lot of people that, that I was able to lean on to get information from. Ironically, a lot of that early stuff I probably don't use anymore because it was so bogus. But eventually, I tapped into university sources and other sources as well. So you start looking at, finding the things that are credible and things that actually work. Because, we're told, well, just this is our program, just do this. But, with having the Soil Lab as a tool, I was always able to either prove it or disprove it. And so you kind of forge your own path, or it allowed me to forge my own path. But, it's kind of ironic that, I started a soil testing laboratory, and I didn't even have chemistry in high school, much less college. I just had a passion and a zeal and a desire, and I just figured it out. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's like the first time I ordered a spectrophotometer, and it was sitting on my lab bench. I didn't even know what it did. All I knew is I needed it, and I had to figure it out. It's really cool. You got this dial here. You put your finger in this one hole, and the light changes colors. Like, wow, the spectrum of the rainbow. I mean, that was just the coolest thing. Well, it's a little more complicated than that, but, that's kind of how I started. When I got my first atomic absorption spectrophotometer, this guy come in and set it up, and he said, well, I'm really short on time here, so let me show you how to turn this thing on and what to do. And bam, bam, bam. You got this flame thing going. You got this fan thing going. You got, all these dials and numbers jumping around all over the place. And, well, I got to get out of here, so you'll be fine. And here I'm sitting there with this instrument on my, down in my basement of my house underneath my bedroom with a big tank of acetylene and oxygen, and it's like, holy crap. But you just figure it out one step at a time. And so I think in a lot of ways that's why it means so much more to me, understanding the depth of everything, because, everything I had to figure out on my own. Mm-hmm. So that was really an interesting journey, and it still is today. So, but getting back to, my fascination with the soil and the agronomic systems and the nutrient cycling, and particularly when you start mixing, really adding diversity in that cropping system, the crop rotation, and the benefits you really see from that, how your soil just comes alive. Mm-hmm. So that's really where it came from. It's just that passion, that zeal that I had.
Mm-hmm. And to me, I'm not a soils guy. Mm-hmm. I know the basics. I can read a basic soil sample. Mm-hmm. But there's so much to unpack there. And you have to really to be successful at it, you really have to have a passion for it. Because it can, for somebody like me, it looks completely overwhelming. Yeah. To try to figure it out. But to have somebody like you that has a passion and a drive for it is a tremendous asset to farmers. Mm-hmm.
Well, and also an understanding that comes from learning the concepts through your own trial and error. Yeah. You can, so then you're breaking it down for somebody that doesn't understand it on the same level you would be from experience, mm-hmm. but you're able to say, okay, here's what this is actually showing me, because you started from the same spot that if I was standing in front of you asking for a plan, and with zero knowledge, or like a base knowledge, you can break it down to a point that, it's not right over my head.
Yeah, I think since, I was never formally trained in it, it's allowed me to help people communicate it to farmers differently than if I had learned all the big words and the technical explanations.
Because I think, for me, I've sat in and listened to a lot of different speakers talking about soils, and some of them, it is so far over my head that I lose interest in it. And I think, just like you said, being able to communicate that to somebody, you have to recognize that these people probably don't have the same passion and the drive that you do, but that you can explain the functions in layman's terms, or however you want to say it, is vital.
Yeah.
So let's just walk through that then. If you're sitting down with a new client or somebody that is just getting started working with you, where are you going to start?
Well, just some examples of being at the conference today. Yesterday, someone came in. They were referred by someone to us, and I wasn't able to get from them who. And they were, they've got, in this particular case, it was a situation that was being grazed. And so they were planting new species in, but they weren't seeing very good results in spite of what they were spending. And they showed me the fertilizer blend that they had applied, how much they applied. And, of course, you could see the analysis and the ingredients that were in it. And then they showed me the soil test. And it was not necessarily the most appropriate thing for them. Because when you look at a soil test, you have the first thing that I look at, you interview the farmer, what they're seeing as the challenges are. And then you look at the soil test numbers. Now, granted, it's not a perfect science, so you have to understand that, and but whatever. I mean, they're a pretty good indicator. Some nutrients better than others, and so it's not like perhaps they weren't spending enough money. They weren't spending in the right places because they said, "Yeah, we've done this 2 years. We haven't seen anything. We haven't got a return on our investment." And that's what really you have to look at fertilizer is. It's an expensive investment, and you have to apply it in a way that you're certain you're going to get a return on it. And a lot of the fertility program, it's almost like you're fertilizing with money. As long as I'm spending enough money, it's going to be fine. And some of these fertility programs can easily exceed $500-600 an acre, and it's just insane, from my perspective at least. And so the process, when you sit down, or I should say, when we or whoever sits down with a farmer, I need to identify what the problem is. Soil tests are a very good tool. And that was the baseline.
Is that would be somebody else's soil test? You're not using your own lab from that starting point. You're looking at a different company's lab results.
Because there's a lot of labs that are very similar to ours. And as long as they're using the same extracts, it's easy to interpret. You take those numbers and, let's say, punch it into our system.
Sure.
When you're using other extracts, there's a few more things you have to be aware of. And it's not as directly, but you still get an idea. So just trying to think of some examples. Well, that was one. And so we talked about, you're not addressing the things that you need to do. And then in this particular case, they were seeding mostly grass. They had very few legumes there. They had an acid soil, which is not going to support very active legume growth. And if all you have is grass in there and you've got no legumes to contribute any nitrogen to the grass, it's not going to do anything. And so often I see the fertility programs where they're selling the farmers like a dry blend because that's what they have in inventory. And where they need to start, if they're going to be successful, you have to start with the nitrogen. And as conventional as that sounds, and sometimes I've come over the years under a lot of criticism because it sounds too much like the university, and within organic circles, they're the ones that caused all these problems. So if you're associated with them, you're part of the problem, not part of the solution. I mean, there's still some of that out there, and obviously I don't agree with that, but that's a whole different subject. Okay, them versus us, and I think it's really coming together. But you have to start with that nitrogen, because that's still what drives everything. And so if you don't have enough nitrogen in the program, why blow your fertilizer budget on trace minerals? Because it's not the trace minerals that are holding it back. So you have to identify, okay, what is the thing that's holding you back the most? Fix that. What's the second thing that's holding you back the most? Fix that. And you just slowly work your way up, to the point where even if a farmer isn't spending as much as he probably should to address all the needs, but you can make just remarkable improvements into the productivity by addressing the two most deficient nutrients, and just you work your way up from that.
So how, if they're lacking in nitrogen in an organic system, what is the mode of action to get that nitrogen level up?
Well, you can either grow it yourself, through the use of legumes, or you can purchase it as a manure source. There, in some cases, we may want to look at Chilean nitrate, which is a restricted product. So you really have to be aware of that, because you're going to limit your potential markets. But it's also very expensive, so it's generally not the first place to go. The other thing that you need to be concerned with is nutrient loading, particularly of phosphorus, because when you're putting manure sources, you tend to be putting on more phosphorus than what you're utilizing. And so over time, your phosphorus levels are going to go higher. And if they're low, it's not a problem. But as they get higher, you're going to need to change your crop rotation, so you're not required to use as much manure in that system, over the course of that crop rotation.
So if you have a pasture, let's say, like you were saying, mostly grass, needs nitrogen, needs legumes, does it, let's say a 20-year-old pasture field, you can just no-till legumes in there for your nitrogen source?
A lot of farmers will do that, and they'll do that successfully. Where some farmers will just completely renovate it and start over. I guess it depends what your starting point is. And the thing is that I make farmers aware of, that if you're going to have, in an ideal pasture, you're going to have grasses and you're going to have legumes. And I don't know that I claim to be like a super grazing expert, in that regard. But, I do understand the fertility aspects of it. And if you need to really cater to that legume portion, because if you don't, you can fertilize it so that the grass gets stronger, that the non-legume portion gets stronger, or you can fertilize it to really get that legume portion to explode. And so that's one of the considerations as you go out there and you look at, okay, what do I need more? Do I need more legumes, or do I need more grasses? Just, find that mix, or whatever type of grazing that you're doing. So when it comes to keeping the legumes really healthy, you need to be concerned with the pH. You need to be concerned with calcium. You need to be concerned with potassium, sulfur, and boron is pretty important as well. If you cater to those legumes, they will become dominant. And if they're too dominant, cut back and do things that will favor the grass more. So, because I've seen situations where it was mostly grass and the legumes are just kind of hanging on for dear life. You put the right fertility on, and boom, the legume just explodes, and you can get your balance back, at least among species. So let's talk details. Why is pH important? Well, pH influences nutrient availability, particularly trace minerals. And one of them is molybdenum. Because molybdenum is important because the nitrogen-fixing organisms, the rhizobial strains, they absolutely have to have molybdenum in order to fix nitrogen. I mean, just a really simple explanation. Well, when the pH, unlike most of the trace minerals, when the pH is low, it's less available, and as the pH increases, it's more available. And so we usually target about 7 because molybdenum is more available, nitrogen fixation occurs. And if you got alfalfa and you got an acid soil and your alfalfa doesn't do well, it's mainly because it's nitrogen deficient. I mean, if you're a conventional grower, you can put urea on there and you can grow alfalfa like crazy, but it's cheaper to fix the problem putting the lime on, correcting the pH. Now, then we got to start talking about calcium because it's just not all about pH. Calcium is really, really important in this as well. Usually when you're liming, the calcium is coming along with it. And so that's one of them. Potassium, legumes have a higher requirement for potassium than it does than grass does. So typically what happens if you neglect a hay field or a pasture, your potassium level continues to drop, and then your legumes just grow less and less and less. Those roots decompose as the legume portion is dying out. The nitrogen mineralizes to an available form, and the grass capitalizes on it. But when the legume disappears, then the grass tapers off, till we hardly have anything growing anymore. So, then you're looking at a real renovation situation for sure. So the potassium is important. Sulfur is important. Do you remember we used to have this thing called acid rain? Mm-hmm. We used to get 10, 15, 20 pounds per acre of sulfur per year just in the rainfall. Mm-hmm. Well, we fixed that. For the most part, we don't get near as much sulfur as we used to. Sulfur is a leachable element. You cannot build it up in your soil. It's held in reserve in the organic portion. So if you've got really high organic matter, then maybe the soil has the ability to supply its own sulfur. Particularly when you get in the medium to light textured sandy soils, sulfur is going to be really important. And it's particularly important with legumes because why do you like to feed hay? Because it's high protein. You need nitrogen and you need sulfur, both, in order for the plant to be able to build those proteins. So that's important. Calcium is just super important because legumes, like all plants, but particularly legumes, and I always like to pick on alfalfa on this one, they kind of have a sweet tooth for potassium. There's a thing called luxury consumption. And so if you put just too much potassium on without keeping your calcium in mind, you wind up with excessive high potassium. And usually what you'll see is the higher the potassium goes in your feed test, the lower the calcium. And so you combat that by making sure you're getting enough calcium, in your program. There's enough in your soil so that the plant isn't excessively utilizing potassium. And the really nice thing is that calcium's a whole lot cheaper to buy than potassium. So it's a cheaper fertility program, and it makes for healthier feed, and you got healthier animals as well. It's just a win-win all the way around. Then, of course, boron is really important, for legumes as well. Not to say that other trace minerals aren't, but when you start looking to build that ladder, okay, what are we going to deal with first? What are we going to deal with second? And just to just improve things the most cost-effective way that you can, for farmers.
So, as a crop consultant, you look at the soil test, you're looking at what they're growing, and you're seeing it is deficient in this. So this is priority number 1, this is priority number 2, down the line. Mm-hmm. Do you look at the crop rotations and look what can we do different within the crop rotation to fix it that way versus just dumping stuff on it?
you're looking at the farming system. Really what you're doing is you're managing resources. You have to. That's why we call our company Ag Resource Consulting. It's all about consulting to manage those resources. The crop rotation is a huge part of that. And I guess, most of my background has been more livestock-based operations. So it makes more sense from that context. But there's your crop rotation, and then there's your manure applications that you would typically have, let's say in a dairy operation. And so putting that rotation together, the biggest effect the thing that you can get from a crop rotation is nitrogen credits. Not so much the other nutrients, but since nitrogen is such a main driver, that's generally where we'll start. So you set up your crop rotation to minimize your off-farm nitrogen requirements. And then it's how you strategically place how much manure in what part of the rotation, on what crops that goes. Because when you come in with your manure, you're providing nitrogen, you're providing phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, and other nutrients as well. But it's mainly the NPK and sulfur that you're really looking at. Yeah, maybe calcium as well. And so even if when we work with a farmer, and even if they're not going to spend any money at all on fertilizer, there's so much improvement you can see just by managing those resources across the farm.
In your nutrient management, do you test the manure?
Yes.
And then the application rates would be depending on what the fields need and when they need it, and because of your manure test.
Yes. Yeah, it's really important to do manure analysis, because when you make assumptions, we've been making a more of a practice of let's say you're going to buy turkey manure, and the supplier will give you an analysis. And so, okay, you take that for granted and you put it on, let's say it's 45 or 50 pounds of N per ton. But sometimes we found out you get to August and the crop is turning yellow on you. It's a case of corn crop. And something went wrong. So we got more diligent about get an analysis, we'll determine how much you need to order. And then when that manure hits your ground, let's get another analysis to verify. And sometimes we've had to, more often than we've previously thought, we've either had to increase the amount of manure that they were getting, or perhaps decrease if it hadn't all been delivered yet. But it's really important because the cost of analysis is so little compared to what you're potentially going to lose if you're missing the mark. Mm-hmm. And when it gets in August and you got your lower leaves firing up from the bottom, you don't have any options at that point. Mm-hmm. All of a sudden, you're 30 to 50 bushel per acre behind.
So on a dairy farm, do you test their manure? Like, how much variation is there in the manure analysis when they're grazing versus on stored feed? Is there a huge variation, or is like a farmer, if he would get one analysis per year, that would be sufficient on their own manure on the farm?
Generally, we would like to see it. Let's say if you're in a liquid manure situation, every time you're pumping that manure out. Okay. Now, there are the agencies have stepped in. Depending upon the size of the dairy you are, they're getting to the point where they're requiring it. It's just part of your nutrient management plan.
So does Minnesota have to have a nutrient management plan on dairies?
Yes.
They do?
Yes.
Yeah. There's parts of Ohio now that have to, but it's not required across all.
It's certainly in Wisconsin as well. Mm-hmm. In fact, in Wisconsin, I believe you have to pull samples multiple times, beginning, the middle, and the end. I think every time you pump a pit out, they want it C3, because sometimes that can change quite a bit as well.
But what about like a bedded pack barn? A solid manure. You would still, like each time you empty that barn, you would get an analysis?
Maybe not have to be quite so stringent, but you'd have to look at the ratio of the manure itself and the ratio of bedding. Mm-hmm. Because sometimes, if you're really good to your cattle and you give them a lot of straw, that is a pretty low value. Then you have to get into, consider carbon to nitrogen ratio, because that's going to determine how much is going to be available the first year versus how much is going to be available the second year and potentially third year and beyond. And so being able to make a manure application, there's a lot of things that you need to consider. But generally speaking, when a farmer is set up, they're going to have, their system in place so that the manure is going to be fairly consistent. Mm-hmm. It's good to, let's say, do it on a yearly basis. And sometimes farmers go beyond that. But if you change things up to where all of a sudden, you've got some manure, there's just a huge amount of bedding in it. You might actually be, manure like that, you might be tying up more nitrogen than the manure is contributing, at least in the short term. So normally what I see is the system's already in place. The manure is not going to change that much. Like the exception would be this year, the last couple of years when we've had excessive rainfall, the analysis has been coming quite a bit lower because the pits are fuller because there's more rain in it, particularly how much runoff you've got from the yard going into that pit. Or sometimes they tie they're shedding from off the roofs and things like that. So,
but quality of feed that those animals would be eating wouldn't be affecting that manure as much.
Oh, that certainly will, because typically, oftentimes, you find that the farms that have really, really low testing soils will have relatively low testing manure as well. Mm-hmm. But you have to look at it from a standpoint of what, the ratios of the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium. But, it's probably a lesser effect, but, we see those trends and those patterns, mm-hmm. definitely.
Because I know with the rainy years that we've had the last couple of years, milk production's down and yields feed quality is down, and that would tell me in my mind that manure quality probably is down as well, and maybe guys need to start looking at other ways of supplementing or to be able to get the crop they're looking
mm-hmm.
for.
Perhaps. But when we have all these really wet years, it really puts organic farmers or any farmers that rely on organic sources, whether it's legumes or whether it's manure, at a disadvantage. Because you put these on, and the biology in the soil needs to break that down through a process we call mineralization. And so you take the protein nitrogen, eventually is going to break down either to an ammonium NH4 or nitrate NO3, which are the two forms that plants utilize predominantly. And if the soil is wet, it's cold, the biology isn't working, those nutrients aren't being released. And so therefore, the crop's just standing still. Conventional labor across the road, they're using urea. I mean, that looks green, it's normal and everything else. But it kind of puts us in the back seat, and certainly we've seen that the last couple of years. You just wait until it warms up, we get some air in the soil, or sometimes it helps to go with a row cultivator to get some air in that soil, and then things start working. But that's been a pretty significant part of maybe what you're seeing as far as why are the feed, the quality of the feed is down. Mm-hmm. That all certainly comes into play.
And talking with farmers that have been doing organic for an extended period of time, and you might be able to confirm this, that in a wet year, organic farmers will usually tend to do worse than as far as quality or yields than conventional farmers. But in dry years, organic farmers tend to do better.
Yes.
I'm assuming that's probably just coming from organic matter being able to hold on to moisture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you can persist through dry conditions better.
Mm-hmm.
And when you see that that nitrogen application on the conventional farm and it gets hot and dry and you see it burned like crazy, you don't see that. We saw that what was it, 2 or 3 years ago in the corn. The neighbors just smoked his corn, and the organic guy right across the road, his looked perfect. And it was just, if he would have gotten the rain there, you wouldn't have seen the burning.
Right.
But it dried up, and would that just be too much nitrogen?
Not necessarily. Well, to the extreme, it certainly could. But I don't think as much over application of nitrogen that there may be occurring. It's harder to justify, with the prices the way they are. I mean, everybody is just running things a lot tighter. I think that has more to do with the improved soil structure, the improved biological activity in the soil. You have better percolation, and better soil structure is just going to help that crop be more resilient.
I think back to when I had a pasture walk with Jerry Brunetti, and he talked about making your soil into an accordion, and he was talking about drought proofing and flood proofing your farm to try to, and that really stuck with me, because he said the more alive your soil is, the better it can hold the moisture, keep the moisture, and you keep the nutrients on your farm, and that's always stuck to me.
Yeah, because if you improve that soil structure, even when you get heavy rains, it'll take it in better versus just wash off. So you've got, you're taking rain and you're holding it deeper into the soil. And so when it gets dry, you have more resiliency to continue forward. Plus the soil structure is better. The roots can more easily grow deeper into the soil and tap into those moisture reserves. So we certainly see that.
So when you're working with a farmer, it sounds like step one, try and figure out what their goals are, try and figure out where money is best spent. Now, if you have somebody that's wanting to commit long-term to your program, are you relying on them to try and figure out what the end goal is, or are you thinking, okay, what we're, say 10 years down the road, we want to see higher organic matter percentages, or we want to see higher soil biology activity, or we want to see, is there an end goal? And I know it's never an end goal, but is there some overarching thing that you're working towards in working with a farmer, or are you relying on them for that?
Well, that's certainly a discussion that we have. More often, you're dealing with what the immediate concerns are and identifying those problems. I would say, what is the goal with farmers? And that is to make their farming operation as self-sufficient as possible. I mean, it's not about how many tons of fertilizer can I get you to import on your farm. I mean, ideally, my goal would be, as you move forward, to actually, fix the deficiencies that you've got and get yourself to the point where you can start minimizing the amount of fertility, that you have to bring on the farm. Because really, in the relationship that we have with the farmer, it's really all about their bottom line, their net profitability, and the sustainability of that farming operation, to bring that resilience to it. And so what is the optimum goal? That they wouldn't have to bring any fertilizer on, perhaps. Now, in some farms, that's possible. In other farmers, you'd never achieve that, simply because you don't have the nutrient holding capacity, and just the way the environment is changing. There's things like sulfur that you, for the most part, not all operations, but let's say the majority, many operations, are still going to have to import the things that your soil can't hold. You can't build sulfur up because that leaches through. The only time I see a soil test that has a high sulfur, I immediately start asking, what's going on here? I mean, did you do something you didn't tell me? Or have you got a severe drainage problem? Because if the water can't drain through the soil, then the nutrients like sulfur will just accumulate and get higher and higher and higher. If it gets too high, it can be problematic as your soluble salts go up. And sometimes you'll see nitrate along with that. When I work with vegetable producers and you have dealing with hoop houses, that's a real interesting scenario because it's all irrigated with well water, what has a mineral content, and you don't have rain coming through. And so it's not uncommon when I test a hoop house that's been in operation 5 or 10 years that you take a 6-inch soil sample and you may wind up with 300 pounds per acre of nitrogen there. And so these nutrients start accumulating. But, that's a whole different game. But getting back to your original question, what is the end goal? To improve the best we can, the resource base, and improve their net profitability. That's what we're invested in. Mm-hmm. And if we need to import nutrients, we need to import fertilizers, manures, lime, whatever. To achieve those, that's what we'll do. That's really what we're targeting.
And I know we've kind of touched on it a little bit. You mentioned like if somebody's spending $500-$600 an acre on some of these fertility programs, they're just spreading money at a certain point. Mm-hmm. But like you said, end goal is, let's say, $0 spent on fertilizer, which may not be totally.
Yeah. We could maybe move toward that goal. Yeah. Okay.
Right. And but I also remember, and this might just be me not having the understanding of soils that I should. But Larry Tranel, does financial reviews on farms and trying to figure out what some of the where money was best spent, and he had profitability numbers and broke it down on what are some areas that the higher profitability farms, where did they put their resources? And one factor that carried across from low profitability, mid profitability, and high profitability was that low profitability farms spent less on seed and soil inputs, and high profitability farms spent more. And I think it ranged from $30 an acre to $120 an acre on the high profitability farms. Mm-hmm. That includes seed, so that might be part of it. But do you have when you're looking at that number, is there something that and I know it'll be change on the farm, but is there something that, yes, we still need to spend a certain amount to make sure that this system continues to go?
Mm-hmm. I'd say that's generally the case. I mean, you really described it. But what I find interesting, when you're working with farmers, the farmers had different attitudes. And there's two predominant attitudes. You either make money by spending money, or you make money by saving money. And I think conventional farmers oftentimes are you make money by saving money. And that would, relying on, agronomists that are really pushing the inputs. We want to make sure that there is nothing in your fertility program that could potentially hold your yield back. So we're going to make sure you got enough of everything. And on the other extreme, you have, farmers that, you make money by saving money. And those, for me, oftentimes are, the hardest ones to work with or to see a value in the services that I provide. And so, and where do you see that attitude most predominant? In grazing-based operations. The ironic thing is sometimes, let's say they'll sign up for an NRCS program and some nutrient management thing, and I've got to go out and soil test. And, to meet their requirements. And it's amazing, like, they have it in their head because they've been told that all I need to do is put cattle out there. And those pastures and that soil is just going to get better and better and better. And I'm looking at some of these operations, they can't even grow decent grass anymore. So you do a soil test, and they got like a 5-6 pH. They got a 3 part per million phosphorus, which is extremely low. they got a 40 part per million potassium. And now it's like you present them with a nutrient plan, fertilizer, program that is so extremely expensive that, I think in one particular case, they just kicked me off the farm. But they have this mentality that I can put a cow out there and it's going to bring milk back to my tank, but I don't have to fertilize because they left manure out there. But the thing is, if that cow isn't taking more off than he brought on, there's not going to be any milk in your tank, or there's not going to be any gain. So it's an extraction process. Mm-hmm. Now, some soils, they have enough natural mineral content that you can coast for years. Mm-hmm. Like in western Minnesota, up and down the River Valley, you get soils that are 300-400 parts per million potassium, and it's such a high reserve there that you can raise alfalfa year after year after year, and every ton of alfalfa is going to take about 50 pounds of potassium out of that. I mean, it's equivalent to 100 pounds of potassium sulfate. So if you're paying $800 a ton, that's $80 for $240 per ton of potassium you're pulling off with that alfalfa. So if you're doing 6 ton, we'll do the math. And if you don't have a soil that has a lot of that in reserve, the levels are just going to drop. And I've seen on lighter texture soil 20, 30 parts per million per year in a soil test, if you got under heavy alfalfa production. And if you ignore it, your productivity is just going to go down and down and down. I mean, that's the expensive part about farming some of these soils, is because they have a higher nutrient requirement than others.
And I think, like you said, they might have good soils, but year after year it keeps going down, and then 10 years down the road they bring somebody like you in, and then the cost is astronomical because they didn't do the maintenance for the last 10 years. Mm-hmm. And one thing I see on grazing operations is they don't understand how much compaction cows make, because we had a training where we did the absorption test, put 1.5 inches of rain in a 8-inch thing, and an hour and a half later it was still sitting there. Yeah. Went out of the pasture field to the edge where the cattle weren't on, and it soaked in what was it, 30 seconds? Mm-hmm. So, when you look at a 1,000-pound animal standing on 8 little pads.
Well, let's say he steps on your foot, it'll really drive it home.
Yeah. And then, especially if it's wetter years, now you're really having compaction issues. So that's where I think the pasture renovation sometimes is needed, simply to get a little bit of air in that soil.
Mm-hmm. And to mix up the species, because things die out, and you get less desirable species out of your native seed bank that come in. And but again, that's a whole another topic.
Well, in our world, as far as the folks that are expecting that just by doing the grazing, putting animals out on ground, in our world, we would call that organic by neglect. Yeah. And those farms don't tend to make the long haul.
Mm-hmm. They save themselves right out of business.
That's exactly right.
Yeah, exactly.
Because, you had touched on it that, some farmers work on, you have to spend money to make money. Mm-hmm. Well, some of the farmers that I work with, the philosophy is not spending anything. Okay. Mm-hmm. But that has a long-term effect, big time, mm-hmm. where the cost of maintenance is generally pretty low. If you have a continuous maintenance program.
Yes.
Where it's like I said, the 10-year of nothing, then all
mm-hmm.
of a sudden that cost is crazy.
Yep.
An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, or whatever that saying is.
And sometimes when I start with farmers, things that are really low level to start with. So you put together a fertility program, maybe it's calling for, to meet their yearly nutrient requirements are going to be, let's say, 400 pounds per acre of a fertilizer. But it's important to know on fertilizer is, okay, I can't afford that. So, then you come down to, what is your budgeting level? And what I'll always tell farmers is you will get a bigger return for your investment with the first half of the application, in this case 200 pounds per acre, than you will the second. And so at least do that much. One scenario, we were looking at a farm that you could do an agronomy training class out there for nutrient deficiency signs in alfalfa. It was clear that the boron deficiency, the sulfur deficiency, the potassium deficiency, the phosphorus deficiency, it was all there. And so it was a situation where he was transitioning as well at that point. And so the money was really tight. And so I says, I tell you what you do. At least come on. And so we put 200 pounds of super cal-SO4 on. So instead of spending, let's say that would have been $125 an acre. He spent $25. Put it on, and you got a good rain. He called me in 3 weeks. He said, I can't believe how much this has changed. It's just completely different. It's just fantastic. And essentially what we did there is that we at least applied the sulfur. And on these lighter textured soils in this current environment that we're in, sometimes I think, when it comes to legumes, such as alfalfa, it's the sulfur that's holding us back the most. I mean, don't neglect that one. It's one of the more cost-effective things that you can do. Now, you can kind of get through that hurdle, but now that you're producing more, you're actually going to see the other nutrients are going to be taxed even further. And so things will really start to continue to go down. And so you kind of buy yourself some time to get in a better position so that you can spend a little bit more and get yourself on track to where you really need to be. So that's a lot of it. I mean, you identify what the problems are, identify what the limiting factors are, and how many resources you have to address those. And sometimes you can go at it quite aggressively, and other times it's just baby stepping it. Mm-hmm. So the thing is to maximize the return of what you're investing in that fertilizer. One of the things that really irritates me is when I hear people say, well, if you get on my program, it's going to take me 5 years to fix this because you've been screwing this up, your dad's been screwing this up, and your grandpa's been screwing this up. I'm going to need at least 5 years in order to fix this thing. And I say that's totally bogus. If you're not getting a return on your fertilizer investment immediately the first year, maybe with the exception of lime, because that sometimes can take 2 or 3 years for that to fully express itself, you're on the wrong track. I mean, you need to get a kickback, quick. So, this business about, it's going to take a long time to fix, you're putting the wrong ingredients in.
And, that might be to fix fully. Mm-hmm. But to see a return shouldn't take 5 years.
Yeah, that's correct. Because ideally, maybe you want to get to the point, what I'd like to see, on a soil test is what we call the critical level. And what the critical level is that once you hit, a certain level, then you don't see a yield response to putting more of that nutrient on. So your fertilizer requirement or your nutrient requirement would be 0. It'd be nice to get everybody up to that point. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's the most cost-effective way to fertilize, where you're actually contributing the most to your net. Or even from a soil structure standpoint. One of the first things that I did when I started testing soil, I was just testing anything, that I could come across. I was just so fascinated by it. It's just so I went to my dad's grove, and where I grew up, and it was probably the native trees from back when everything was settled, because it was kind of an oak savanna area. And so I tested the soil. It had beautiful structure, high organic matter, aggregates, got angleworms. It's just beautiful. And I thought, boy, this is just going to be the perfect stuff. And to get it through the lab, and it was horrible. It had like a 5.2 pH. The phosphorus is less than 5 part per million. And it should be in that particular context. It should have been like, let's say 25. The potassium is really low, but the trees liked it. The biology liked it, but that doesn't mean that it has the fertility to grow the high value, the high yielding, and the high quality nutrition value crops that we're growing, that we genetically selected for in the varieties. You could have taken those trees out. Maybe you could have mined that soil for maybe 2, 3, 4 years before things really started to drop. But this is something that's really important. It's like the world that we're in right now. You got to understand, how did we get here? We have all this talk about soil health and all these new ideas, and everybody's just all these really supposedly smart people coming up with all these ideas. But everything that they're talking about, 80% of it, you can find in the 1938 Yearbook of Agriculture, and then revisit again in the 1957 Yearbook of Agriculture. All that stuff is there. The organic matter, the carbon, the nitrogen, the crop rotations, the impact of importance of animals, in that cropping system. So, what happened? We've been asleep at the wheel for the last 80 years. And what we've allowed, just coming from wearing my organic consultant hat here, is that in the 60s and 70s, we went into the chemical age of agriculture. It's like we've allowed the ag chemical industry to hijack the direction that agriculture went. And by the time we got in the 70s and 80s, we started to see the side effects of it. And we've been working our way back to, hey, we got all these new discoveries. No, we didn't. All this stuff is going back 80 years.
It was just on the shelf collecting dust for 80 years.
That's right. And so then, you get this thing about, we came from the direction of all you need is chemistry. That's all you need. It's just going to fix the problems. Now we're on the opposite range of the spectrum, where all you need is biology. And so everybody's running down that path. And the truth is always in the middle. So what you're going to see is backlash, that in spite of the fact that, we're building soil, yada, 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 we're not necessarily meeting the chemical. And when I'm talking chemical, I'm talking like the nutrient aspects of it. And so, we're going to go too extreme that way. Then we're going to start coming back the other way. And that's where it is. And sometimes I feel like it was like the people like what we do. You're the medics on the battlefield, and you're going out there doing as much good as you can, and the bullets are coming at you from both directions. Because the chemical side don't like what we're doing, and the pure soil health biology people don't like what we're doing. But that's where we need to be in order to do the most good for the farmers.
That explains it, because the question I was going to ask when you said you went in your dad's grove and found this beautiful looking soil and saw that there was soil biology and earthworms, and I know talking with the farmers that we work with a lot, that's the indication of everything is going to automatically start working once you get that soil biology active. And I tend to agree that is true, that you need the soil biology to be active. But what you just said there makes a lot more sense, that it also takes the right nutrients to then create the environment where that biology can provide the crop with the actual nutrients that it needs to be, to lead to that organic principle of healthy soils, healthy food, healthy people.
Yeah, that's right. Let's just talk about CRP, for instance, because we've done a ton of work on CRP, because when that comes out, it goes organic, potentially.
Could you, for the listeners, just explain the CRP program?
Conservation Reserve, CRP, Conservation Reserve Program. And basically what that was, it was started in the 80s, where you would take marginal land, and the USDA through NRCS, FSA, NRCS, they would basically rent the land from you for a price that you would agree upon, because you would kind of put a bid in, and it would be negotiable or somewhat at least. But anyway, for a price. And then what you would do is you would seed it down to some type of a permanent cover, and usually a grass legume mix, and they would have very prescribed seed mixtures. And then your responsibility was to keep the trees from growing on it. You had thistle or certain weeds that you had to manage, whether you sprayed them or you mowed them or whatever. It was just up to you how to do it. And then at the end of the 10 years, then you could put it back into crop production, or in some cases, you put it back into you can put it back into CRP again for another 10 years. So some of the CRP that we worked with farmers taking it out, was in for 20 years. And when they started with this program, they talked about how you're going to improve your soil, and because you're not doing any tillage, and it's going to be a permanent yada yada yada. But what we really found was that at the end of it, we were expecting those soil improvements, and in some ways we did see improvements, but some ways we didn't. From an organic perspective, because you can't go out and spray it, so you typically going to have to go in and do some pretty aggressive tillage. The issue, you had such a thatch layer on top. You had so much carbon that needed to be digested that you generally take a yield hit for a year or two. That's why we generally would go in with a crop such as soybeans that would fix its own nitrogen at least the first year. But it seems like it took some of those soils, it would take like 3 years to really get it back into full swing of production. And this more recent one that I got involved with, the pHs were 8.2, the phosphorus were 3 parts per million, and the potassium was 150 parts per million. Give or take, just coming from memory. And, I started to see a pattern, is that when you take soil and you put it into production and you give it the things that it needs, your nutrient levels are going to improve and your productivity is going to improve. But if you just leave it and don't do anything with it, it's like it reverts back to, its native state. And of course, in this course, it was like 20 years. And different soils, those numbers and ratios and whatever are going to be different than other soils, depending upon a lot of things. But I guess where I'm going to on this is that it's far more cost effective just to fertilize as you're going along, rather than fertilize up to that ideal level. And don't worry too much about not having the perfect numbers on a soil test, because soil tests are they're kind of like, let's say you're flying an airplane from New York to Los Angeles. Okay, so you put it on autopilot, and then every once in a while you have to check your course and alter your course. Where soil tests are like that. So generally, farmers will test soil every 3 years. It's kind of the standard right now. So every 3 years you test it. The numbers change. Maybe they don't. Hopefully they change for the better. So you alter your course, what your fertility program is. Then you go another 3 years and you test it again and you alter it. And because you're never flying completely from point A to point B, you're 100% accurately. You're going this way, but you have to alter your course. And that's how you should look at how soil tests should be used, to fine-tune the fertility and make sure you're going in the right direction. It's more important on a soil test, not where the numbers are, but the direction that they're going. And that's something that, we certainly, keep in mind when we're interpreting them as well. The other thing is that if you're on a required to have a nutrient management plan, they're required to use university recommendations, whether it's Minnesota, Wisconsin, whatever region you're in. And if you follow them, they're really only going to get you maintain levels of maybe in the medium to high, but they won't necessarily take you to the very high levels. They're conservative because they're programmed based on return on your investment is what they're doing. And so, but I always found that to be real interesting in that it's still probably the most conservative, the most cost-effective way. But the thing that, I mean, if you're into raising crops that you're really trying to push the forage quality and nutrient density, sometimes you have to go a little bit beyond. Particularly on your, it's like your NPK gets you your yield, but it's your secondary nutrients and your traces that get you the quality. And so you just have to figure out how to do that without, bankrupting yourself.
And before we wrap up here, I just got one more question. It gets a little bit into the theoretical, and it's, you talked a little bit about the Red River Valley and having that store of potassium or phosphorus, whichever one it was. And, there seems to be these areas of the country, and we all know and have examples of different areas that are, they're primed to grow good crops. And when I work with people that are living in areas that don't have that type of soil, they say, oh, we can't do what they do because we don't have their soil. Mm-hmm. And my thought, and this is just concept and me thinking, is that with the right program and working in the right direction, can anybody get to that level of production off of any ground, or is there always going to be this variation based on what you're starting with?
Well, I'll respond by saying there's no such thing as a perfect soil. It's like getting married. Till bankruptcy do you part. And they're unique, but they always got the things that you have to cater to. Because some soils, there's certain aspects that you never have to worry about. Other soils, you have to worry about those a lot. And so you can make all soils more productive. But you'll never you shouldn't be focusing on making it perfect.
Well, and I guess I'm thinking of, if we hear of farmers out west that are getting 10 ton to the acre dry matter production off of pasture fields. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the Midwest, that seems outlandish.
Yeah.
Is there a way, if with the proper management, that somebody could achieve that, or is just the soil that they have in the West just a different animal that allows for that? I
would say, barring any drainage concerns, either your soil is just like beach sand, like sands in an hourglass, that type of stuff, or if you have soil that just really poor drainage. I mean, and some of that you can control with improving soil structure and everything else. You can do a remarkable job of increasing your yield and increasing your quality. Probably one of the better farmers that I work with is on relatively sandy ground. And he's a straight shooter, but he absolutely insists that he's producing 7 and 8 ton per acre dry matter on his alfalfa. His corn silage is approaching and exceeding 30 ton per acre. His corn yields are, and this is like in central Minnesota, so we're seeing corn yields of 200 bushels, barley yields of 120 bushels per acre. This guy's doing a lot of things right. But he doesn't skimp on the inputs. What he's applying is very appropriate for what his goals are. So, yeah, you can fine-tune things to move in those directions. But there are certain soil types where you just have certain impediments that managing those are just totally out of your control. I mean, a really good example, you have a really, really sandy soil over the top of a really high water table. So if you're 2 inches short, you're in a drought. If you get 2 inches too much, water's standing there. I mean, I've at one time farmed soil like that, and it is extremely frustrating. So it's ground like that, you have to be careful. Okay, trying not to do too much to fix that. I mean, you could tile it, but the water comes up the tile line and fills everything up. It just move on. Mm-hmm. I mean, sometimes it's just sell it, find a different piece of ground someplace. I don't know. But I'd say for the most part, I mean, those areas can be pretty easily identified. But for the most part, it's just put together, an appropriate plan. And as long as you have appropriate moisture, you can really significantly improve things. The biggest thing is in some areas, there's some nutrients you'll never have to apply. In other areas, you pretty much have to apply them every year. I mean, a good example is out in western Minnesota where you have such high alfalfa. Your inputs don't have to be nearly as high. Let's say you're farming irrigated sand in the Anoka Sand Plain, where you almost have to, you just have to put a lot more on. So your cost of production is higher. Mm-hmm. Generally, that land is a lot cheaper, so it's a trade-off. So, hey, I can get land for $100 an acre, or I can get land for $200 an acre. The difference is if I rent the $200 an acre land, my fertilizer costs are $100 an acre less. So there's different things in the equation that you really have to look at.
Yeah. Well, and that's kind of why I was asking, because we work with farmers that have extremely expensive ground and $10,000, $20,000, $30,000 an acre in some cases, and then where I live in Michigan, you can also find ground for $500 to $1,000 an acre.
Yeah.
And what the guys on the $500 to $1,000 an acre ground would say is, I just don't have the ground that those guys do. Well, I tend to agree with that. They don't. Mm-hmm. But with the right program, you can still you can get to the point of getting the production off your ground, what they're seeing down there. It's just going to cost you more. Mm-hmm. So then it just goes back to, I think, the mentality of the two different types of farmers, either making money by spending money or making money by saving money. Yeah. And typically, if somebody's going to go into an area that's $500 to $1,000 an acre, they're the type that are going to try and make money by saving money.
There was a saying that I once heard, and you may want to take this off, that poor land attracts poor farmers.
Some need to hear it, though.
I'll leave it to your discretion.
When I see an area where it's poor, you see a lot of empty farms sitting around. Not all the fields are rented out, and people are excited about buying the land because, well, if the farms all went out of business, there was probably not the greatest place to have a farm. So I think what you just said there, I tend to agree that unfortunately, there's some truth to that.
Yeah. Some land should be let go back to trees, particularly in the current environment. And I could go on and on and on. Talking about ethanol and increasing the demand for corn, and all of a sudden they're chopping all these trees down and punching holes in the ground and irrigating land like crazy back when corn was $5, $6, $7 an acre, and now it's down to $3.5, and they can't make money on this, this ground anymore, in spite of all the infrastructure and everything that they put in, and some of the insanity of some of that is. It was very in the moment thinking, put it that way. So,
well, I think we're going to wrap it up here, but I really appreciate you taking the time sitting down with us. I found it fascinating.
Mm-hmm. Well,
so I'm
glad to be here.
I'm definitely going to use a lot of stuff I learned today in my visits with farms. So thanks.
And is there contact information if anybody wants to reach out to you if they've got any questions?
Yeah, that's certainly, let's see. Again, our company is Ag Resource Consulting Incorporated. We're based in Albany, Minnesota. Our office phone number is 320-845-6321. And we have a website, agresourceconsulting.com. You can find us there as well.
Perfect.
And let's just say it's a website in process, but the contact information is there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, thanks a lot.
And thank you very much for having me. I enjoyed this.
Yep. Thanks for listening to another episode of Back to the Roots podcast, brought to you by Albert Lee C.